Okay, so I just noticed on all of these recordings that it looks like I'm sitting in pajamas. I actually have a hooded sweatshirt on. This is my whole Corona thing. See? Yeah. So whatever, it is what it is, and here we are. So, what I'm going to do in this next section is to talk about total surplus. That's why I didn't want to use the idea or use the terminology total surplus when we talked about producer surplus and consumer surplus, because total surplus is consumer and producer surplus. So I tried to use the term sum. I just think it makes it a little clearer. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen with you and we will get this going. Okay, so here we are. Again, the idea of all of these is to take a look at, is this market efficient, which we'll get into in the next section. But let me go ahead and start this. Okay, so we do still talk about the benevolent social planner, yada, yada. Okay, so total surplus. What is total surplus? And total surplus is equal to consumer plus, I should say, producer surplus. Okay, so when we add those two things together, we get total surplus. And why does this matter to us in terms of market efficiency? It matters to us in terms of market efficiency because here's the idea. We want to ensure that, come on, work with me. Okay. Those consumers who have the highest willingness to pay get the product, and those producers who can supply the product most efficiently according to their cost are able to do so. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking for in this idea. Okay, so let me clear these drawings and go on to the next slide. Okay, so again, total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And again, that's the value to the buyers minus the price that they pay, the amount received to sellers minus the cost. I want to show you something kind of important right here is because we could say, well, amount paid by the buyers, that's really just the price. Whoops, price, okay? And the amount received by the sellers, we could just say that's price. So if you really want to think about this, we could say, okay, value to the buyers minus the amount paid by the buyers, which is essentially price, and the amount received by the sellers, which is essentially price. So what we can really say is that the total surplus are the two things which are left over in this, the value to the buyers minus the cost to the sellers. So this is an important factor, and I think there's a short answer question on the next test, which asks you to kind of talk through this algebra with words, okay? And a lot of people avoid that question. I think it's a simple question, but, who am I, okay? All right. So again, efficiency, the idea of those that total surplus received by all members of society, and equality, meaning the distribution of these economic resources. Okay, so we go back to those ideas that we talked about in chapter 1 of the question of efficiency. I mean, are we the most efficient producers? And here we really want to think about this in terms of, question of efficiency is the cost. Okay, so we're going to say you're an efficient producer if you can produce this at the lowest cost. Okay, and equality is the idea that those that value it most highly get it. Now, this doesn't apply to everything, okay? And we're going to talk about that in the next section. But so we would say that here, their willingness to pay is the idea of equality. Okay. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we do that for all products. Okay. Because just think about, your book uses the example of kidneys, for example. We don't leave that up to markets to decide. So we have governmental intervention, which we would say, as economists, that's a market failure because it's not efficient. Okay, so far we've said a market's efficient if those that value it most highly get it, and those that can supply it according to their cost are able to do so. Now we're going to add a second prong to that. Okay, so the first prong was, can we get to market equilibrium? The second prong we're going to add now is the question whether total surplus is maximized. If it is, the point of the triangle will touch quantity equilibrium. So let me go ahead and share the next slides with you because I think it's important to take a look at exactly how this will look. Okay, so let's go ahead and share that. And here. Okay. Again, taking a look at market outcomes here. Okay. Now, here's total surplus. Okay, so total surplus, we really look at, and let me get a spot here. Okay, here's consumer surplus. These are the consumers that value it most highly, and this is the amount of consumer surplus that they have. Notice also, if you will, that these individuals up here have a much higher willingness to pay than these individuals down here. Likewise, we can say that these producers down here are much more efficient than these producers over here because they have, as producers get toward point E, they have a much higher cost. And so therefore we would say that they are not as efficient. Now take a moment and look at this. And notice that total surplus. Okay, so total surplus would be consumer surplus, the blue, along with producer surplus, the red. When you add those up, notice this big triangle. And notice that this triangle's point is right here at equilibrium quantity. And that's kind of important because now we can see that this particular market, yes, it's efficient because we can get to quantity equilibrium. That was test one. Second point or second test is whether consumer surplus and producer surplus, add them together, get total surplus, is maximized. Or does the point of the triangle for total surplus touch market equilibrium? If it does, then this is efficient. Yeah, you can hear my TAs in the background. Okay, so again, we're going to say at market equilibrium, we are what we call Pareto efficient. Now, this won't be on the test, but I do have a YouTube video that I found that I think discusses Pareto efficiency pretty well. That's optional. If you're interested, go ahead and view it. If you're not, that's fine too. Okay, so at market equilibrium, we have the efficient allocation of resources. And I want to add to this just a little bit and say at market equilibrium or when total surplus is maximized, we have an efficient allocation of resources. So we would say leave the market as it is. Don't bother getting involved, particularly in terms of government intervention, which we're going to look at coming up in some different chapters. Okay, now this particular slide is a little bit different and some students have a little trouble interpreting it. So let me kind of show you, and what would be the best way? Probably drawing, I think. Okay, so this first red arrow that you see here, let's see, there we are. This first red arrow that you see here, notice at a quantity, any quantity, that is less than equilibrium. So any quantity from equilibrium over. What we're going to say here is all of those quantities from equilibrium over, the value to the buyers is greater than, let me find the greater than key on a keyboard, I don't normally use that one, is greater than the cost to the sellers. Okay, so at any point from equilibrium, well, in this case, from 0 to equilibrium quantity, the value to the buyers exceeds the cost to the sellers. And you can see that when you look at the red arrow versus the blue arrow. If we were to follow those over, we can see that the blue arrow would touch at a much higher price than where the red arrow would touch. So that's why we say the value to the buyers exceeds the cost to the sellers. At any point above equilibrium quantity, from here over, we're going to say that, hey, it's kind of flipped. So what happens is the cost to the sellers is greater than the value to the buyer. Okay, so that too doesn't sound like good economic theory. So essentially, what we're trying to say from all of this, let's see, let me get rid of my, okay, is that when we look at this point right here, only at equilibrium, do we have the equal, meaning that the value, value to the buyer is equal to the cost to the seller. At any other point on this graph, we either have, in this case, we have the cost to the sellers less than the value to the buyers. Over here, we have the value to the buyers less than the cost to the sellers. Only at equilibrium is the value to the buyer equal to the cost to the seller. Okay, so that kind of sums up our second test to determine whether or not a particular market is efficient. Again, can you get to quantity equilibrium? Test 1. Test 2, is total surplus maximized, or does that point of the triangle of total surplus hit quantity equilibrium? Thank you. Stay safe, be well, and I'll see you in a little bit.